So it had been a very busy Black Friday at the 7-Eleven. Now, we don't usually even run specific Black Friday deals. This was 2019, and we'd done that bring your own cup deal the year before. And plenty of people showed up with cups for infinite refills this year too. And we had to explain that our store wasn't running that promotion this year. Like every store, we had certain items on discount, but nothing really worth getting excited about. Now, despite that, judging by how busy the damn store had been, you'd have thought we were giving Doritos and Mountain Dew away for free. I'd taken the shift thinking that it couldn't possibly be that stressful. I've worked retail at Target and Best Buy on Black Friday, and holy God, I'd rather drop a 60-inch TV on my head than ever do that again. This really happened to a customer, by the way. Anyway, that's not the point of the story. The point is that I'd been rushed non-stop on my feet, and it wasn't until around 4 a.m. or so that I finally had a break, when the store slipped back into its usual, basically empty, late-night state. And basically, what I'm saying is that I was so busy, so rushed, that I have an excuse for failing to lock the back door after I'd taken out some cardboard earlier. I should have been more careful, but I wasn't expecting the store to be that busy with only me, Rex, and Lila, this girl I'd been crushing on, managing the store. And so, yeah, I left the back door open. And you know, when I said the store was finally empty at around 4 a.m., well, it wasn't. You see, a seemingly unhoused individual had snuck in through the back door and was camped out in the small storeroom, helping himself to as many non-perishable goods as he could stuff into his damn face. And by the time my co-worker Lila stumbled across him after heading back there to restock the Cheetos, half the guy's face was blue from Taki dust. Now she called me in immediately, and I rushed in, trying to play hero. This guy had been hungry, but not for anything healthy. He'd been tucking into Twinkies and jerky and Takis, and so much junk food that it makes me sick just thinking about it. And my God, he'd been downing so many warm cans of Red Bull and Monster Energy. He was a big, big guy, and he'd stripped off his winter coat and sweater, and at this point, he was just wearing shorts and a dirty white vest. Now, based on the little nest that he'd made for himself in the corner of the storage room, I think he'd been planning on actually bedding down for the night there. Now, I was a little taken aback, but all I could really say was, "Hey, buddy, you know you've got to pay for that." And the guy just looked up at me and blinked, and I swear to God, I could see the moment it dawned on him that this stuff wasn't just free, and he was going to be responsible for the cost. Now, I felt a little bad for him because he clearly seemed to be homeless and very destitute, and probably on drugs, even if he was colossally fat and eating junk food. But I still hated being the one to tell this guy, who was obviously down on his luck, that he was liable for pretty much hundreds of dollars worth of snacks. However, then he stands up, and that chalky dust was flying everywhere, and he points this big, chubby finger at me and says, "And how the hell do you expect me to explain this to my wife?" Now, once again, I'm a bit taken aback. The dude's walked in and just sort of helped himself to our stock, and now I'm being angrily asked how he's going to tell his wife. I don't know, man. Maybe you shouldn't have eaten our snacks in the first place, I thought. And that's kind of what I say, only in a more tactful way. And then he starts screaming at me that if I hadn't wanted him to eat the chips, I shouldn't have left the door open as an invitation. I guess he kind of had a point. I shouldn't have left the back door open. But if you see someone's house is open, you just don't go in and start eating their food, do you? And I said this to him, and he thought about it for a moment, like the answer might have even been yes. And then this guy says, "You're not calling the cops, and you're not calling my wife." So I say, "Okay, we can avoid all that if you can pay for all the items you've eaten, and then we can just sort of make things work." Unfortunately, this guy said that this wasn't going to work for him. He needed to find a solution where the cops and his wife wouldn't get involved, but he wouldn't be stuck with the bill. I asked him what he proposed, and he gave a few ideas. 1, we made him the winner of our Black Friday sweepstakes, which is not a thing. 2, I go halves with him and pay for half the food, and then he could just about manage the rest. Obviously, no. And then his final offer was that he would pay for all the food he'd eaten, as long as Lila would do a full striptease for him first. Having the crush that I did on Lila, and not being able to hold back on the white knighting, I told the dude exactly where he could shove his takis, before instructing Lila to call the cops and let our other co-worker, Rex, know what was going on. Lila gave me this look that made me think my white knighting may have gone over well, so I was feeling pretty cool in that moment when I faced down Chalkmouth. I figured we'd argue for a while until the cops showed up or Rex came to see what was happening. Instead, all 300+ pounds of Chalkmouth came barreling at me with a speed I never would have expected from someone his size. It was like Big the Cat had fused with Sonic and gotten all 7 Chaos Emeralds. And congrats if you're autistic enough to get that joke. Now, I'm not a small guy, but I'm not big either. I'm pretty average in every way. Wink, wink. Anyway, distraction aside, I'm not big or tough enough to take the full brunt of being slammed into by this Chalkmouth's considerable bulk. His hefty stomach bounced me sideways, and I went tumbling into a pile of Char's toilet paper. It could have been worse, I suppose. So then, Chalkmouth burst out of the storeroom door, with me scrambling after him. I heard Lila screaming something, and then there was this huge crash that sounded like a body slamming head first into a now locked back door. It sounded like that because that's exactly what it was. The guy had tried to flee the way he'd come, but he hadn't counted on the fact that Rex had locked the back door while Lila was calling the cops. And so Chalkmouth charged head first into what he thought was an open door, only to be sent flying backward into a chokeslam by the most jacked, roided-out biker of a co-worker I'd ever had the pleasure to work with. I have no idea why we called him Rex, but he was an absolutely huge, muscular guy who was able to chokeslam this homeless dude to the ground and pin him there until the cops arrived. The three of us got into a bit of trouble for leaving the back door unlocked, but there was no camera footage showing who had failed to lock it, and we all agreed to keep that piece of information to ourselves. So the worst we had to deal with was a lecture from the area manager about mindfulness and safety. Now the Chalkmouth was facing some strange charges. He avoided a breaking and entering charge because the back door had been unlocked, and despite the sheer amount of what he'd eaten, and the fact that he'd eaten it on the premises, it was reduced to a shoplifting charge, which led to a fine and a suspended sentence. Oh, and remember how I said he appeared to be unhoused? The guy was married with a wife and kids. I feel bad for him in a way. He seemed to be dealing with insomnia and some kind of mental health issues from stress at his job, and he had started taking Ambien, and it was generally decided that the Ambien was making him act a little off. And I'm not sure though, and I'm not sure I can really blame the Ambien either. I think the guy may have just been hungry for Takis. I never used to work Black Friday. I flat out refused. And so, as a compromise, each year I agreed to stay late with one other colleague and prepare for Black Friday. It wasn't such a big deal back then. We'd just run a big sale on the Friday, and that was it. You know how Black Friday used to be. But it did mean setting up some nice displays the night before and making the store look presentable and exciting. Now, this was back when sales weren't run every 5 minutes, so they were actually a pretty big deal if you were trying to save money. Now, remember when the Lila sales used to start after Christmas and offered some really great savings that you'd never find at any other point during the year? Black Friday was like that, but just a single day. So I refused to work Black Friday because I can't deal with that many demanding customers. But I was happy to take charge of the quiet setup the night before. Now, as I recall, I was setting up a pyramid of VHS player boxes when I first heard the sound. It came from near the kitchen appliance section, and I knew that neither of my co-workers were over there because I could see them, and it sounded like a refrigerator door opening and closing, which was unsettling because there was no reason any of them should ever be opened outside of a demo. In my infinite bravery, I decided to ignore it and move on to the next display, which was a set of discounted stereo system components. Then one of my colleagues came over and asked me if there was anyone else here, because they were certain they had seen a fourth staff member hanging around near the camcorders and cameras. I told them no, it was just the three of us, but that we would go and check it out. There was no sign of anyone, but one of the cameras was slightly misaligned, as if it had been moved. So I decided to check the footage, and that was when I noticed something strange. There were a few seconds of film showing a guy with a very thick mustache and heavy Coke bottle glasses staring straight into the camera, almost as if he were in shock. Then, just as quickly, the footage cut off. Unfortunately, the display model wasn't properly set up with the correct time and date. Because of that, I couldn't tell for sure exactly when the strange recording had been made. The answer was soon given to us when the storeroom door visibly creaked open right in front of us and then suddenly slammed shut. There was no way that this could have been me or any of my colleagues. So the three of us ran to the storeroom and did the bravest thing we could, locking it from the outside and then looking in through the window. The same guy we'd seen on the footage was sitting in the corner of the stockroom, dressed in pajamas, with a sleeping bag laid out on the floor beside him. Obviously, in that moment, we called the cops. It turned out that the customer had hidden in the store at closing that night, so he could be there bright and early when we opened for Black Friday, by never leaving the store in the first place. In many ways, it all seemed oddly wholesome, aside from the breaking and entering. However, things took a darker turn when the cops searched through the guy's belongings and found a camcorder taken from the shelf, which I hadn't even realized was missing at the time. The footage they found on it was very disturbing. He must have filmed it within the previous few hours, and it included footage of both me and my other female colleague on shift, in compromising and very revealing positions from under the stalls. This creep had clearly been hiding in the bathroom, waiting for us to enter, and after figuring out how the camcorder worked, he decided to give himself some overnight entertainment to pass the time while he waited for Black Friday. Naturally, we pressed every charge in the book, and he faced some pretty serious consequences. Now, I was less impressed by the footage when it was played back in court, but it was worth it just to send that complete creeper away for a decent amount of time. Now, I'm sure he's long since been released by now, because this was quite a while ago. But I hope I never have to encounter that creepo, weirdo, Black Friday pervert again, if he's even still alive. And maybe it makes me a bad person, but I kind of hope he isn't. So, I've been working at a Walgreens for over 30 years now. Now, this happened just a couple of years ago, and to this day, it remains one of the most disgusting things to ever happen, not to me, but to a colleague. Now, Nora was a new girl working checkout at the pharmacy. I'm a pharmacist, so I sign off and dispense prescriptions. But Nora sold over-the-counter medication and would hand out prepared prescriptions to customers and so on. And so, checkout staff at the pharmacy have a small degree of medical training, but nothing really major. If a customer needs proper medical advice, they'll be sent over to me or one of my colleagues, and if we can't help, we'll advise them to seek medical attention. Now, this one day, a middle-aged guy comes over to Nora at her post. I'd seen him before collecting prescriptions with his wife, and I was pretty sure that he had 2 daughters as well. This time, he was alone. He told Nora that he was suffering from a rash on his upper thigh, and that it was extremely aggravating. He told her that he'd taken some photos with his camera phone that only showed the rash and would be easier and less embarrassing than having to show his actual thigh. Nora should have directed him to me, but being inexperienced, she agreed to take a look at the photo. But as it was, she deduced that the rash was caused by some kind of allergic reaction and suggested trying an antihistamine cream, which should help the rash go down. All was well for about a week, and then that rashy guy returned. He said that initially the cream had helped, but it stopped being effective, and he'd taken a new photo to show the current state of things. Now, this made sense to Nora, as it was entirely possible that he simply needed a stronger dose of the cream, something she'd mentioned to him beforehand. This time, as she tells it, when he showed her the photo, it was angled slightly differently, and you could, unfortunately, see a small sliver of his nut on the right-hand side of the image. Nora tried her best to hide her blush, and she was only 19 after all. But this guy didn't seem to notice. She recommended that he try a stronger version of the cream, and hopefully that would clear things up. Now, a couple of weeks later, when I'm on shift, he shows up again. I notice him this time, and it nags at the back of my mind that he always seems to appear when Nora's on shift, even though she worked very limited hours per week as a temporary job while studying some kind of biology in college. Now, this time when he shows her the photo, you can clearly see most of his left ball and a sliver of, well, you know what. Nora, ever the professional, did not acknowledge this, despite flushing very red. Now, Mr. Calder asked her if she was okay, and even joked that his bare thigh was turning her on. Now, I overheard this and made a note to talk to Nora after he had left, to let her know that she didn't have to deal with people like that. Now, she eventually admitted to me that the photos had become increasingly revealing and she hadn't entirely known how to handle it. At that moment, I was furious. However, she explained to me that sometimes on iPhones, they don't show you the entire area of a photo, and it's possible to accidentally reveal slightly more around the edges than intended. I told her that I thought she was being extremely generous and to be very careful around this creep. Now, eventually, he turns up again, and shock and horror, his rash has returned. He tells Nora that he's taken the photo as tastefully as possible, but that he needs to show the full rash. And so, as you might expect, he pulls up an entire picture of his wiener, with only a portion of his right ball hidden. Now, furthermore, the rash was the same size as it always had been, which, as Nora then realized, was an almost perfect square. And she handled herself well. She said that she was extremely concerned about the customer's safety, that there was a severe risk of permanent loss of function, and that she had to call the trained pharmacist right away. Now this guy immediately started freaking out and said it wasn't a big deal and not to bother me. But Nora called out, saying that she had seen evidence of a potentially devastating injury and asked if I could help. Now this brazen guy was torn between worrying about his harassment being exposed and half believing that Nora was telling the truth, that he was about to maybe lose function of his you-know-what. And so I came straight out of the pharmacy, and he refused to show me the photo. I asked him why he was comfortable showing Nora, but not me, and I'd seen it all before. And he started stumbling over his words and didn't have an answer for me. I half expected him to turn and leave and never darken our door again, but instead, he did something very unexpected. He grabbed a bottle of cough medicine and threw it hard against the counter, causing it to burst. And then he fled in the ensuing confusion. I'm not sure if he thought the cough medicine would function as some kind of kung fu smoke bomb or what, but clearly he'd forgotten that as a client of the pharmacy, we had his name and address, as well as all the details of his family. Now, we reported the whole incident to the cops, who said that they may not have been able to pursue any sort of harassment charges, as he could have claimed an accidental reveal, but that by smashing the cough syrup, he implied intent with his behavior, which allowed us to press charges for that, and involved his wife finding out about everything. Clearly, he just wanted to intimidate a young pharmacy worker, and instead, he ended up on the offenders registry. Probably not the outcome he was hoping for. So, I've been a head loss prevention officer at my local ASDA for close to 20 years by this point, and I've seen some wrong-uns on both sides of the fence, let me tell you. There was a shoplifter, a big, buff, tattooed bloke who would only nick scented candles. And then there was the young lad on the checkout who played five-a-side with us, who turned out to be pretty weird with kids. Now, none of them hold a torch to Colin, though. Colin made Gary Glitter look like a decent bloke. Well, maybe not quite that extreme, but he was certainly a massive S-word, who I would not shed a tear for if he unalived his own life, as the TikTok kids might say. And so Colin was the most zealous loss prevention officer I've ever met. This was mostly a good thing. For lads like me who took the job seriously, with almost military precision. If anyone swiped a jar of Marmite or a pack of crumpets, Colin would be on them like flies on poo. He would frog march them straight to the security office, and then he'd spend around half an hour in there. And I swear down, that person would never shoplift again. Now, I'd never heard any complaints about Colin. Not one. But I guess it turns out that when you scare people into silence, they don't tend to complain about you. To this day, I do not know what Colin said or did to persuade the guy to go straight. For all I know, it was always the same routine. But when I found out that he was persuading young girls to go straight, well, it made me sick to my stomach. It was a totally idiotic coincidence how I caught Colin at it, though. I was in the security office, and I somehow managed to get myself locked into the security closet. Don't ask me how. To this day, I couldn't explain it. Fate, maybe. And so Colin brings this girl in, maybe 18 or 19, and immediately he starts explaining to her how he's not just a security guard, he's secret police. And then he flashes some kind of badge, which I couldn't make out through the slats in the door. But I guess it was convincing enough because the girl starts crying, begging and apologizing. And so Colin tells her that he's only pulled her aside because, get this, she's a suspected enemy of the state. Apparently, there are things that flag up to his people, and he has to pay extra special attention to them. He's implying to this lass that his people would be capable of making her disappear unless she cooperated. Colin's idea of cooperation was, to put it mildly, obscene. And the way he explained it, the items she was stealing, in this case bread, tomatoes, and beans, were a coded combination for other agents to know that she was strapped with explosives. It was clearly absolute nonsense, but, long story short, he could make any trouble go away if she let him take some shots of her without clothes to prove that she wasn't wired or strapped with explosives. Now, I have no idea if this girl believed him, but she certainly believed that she could avoid escalation if she just did what he said and stripped off for him. And so I was there, stuck in the damn closet, while he persuaded this girl to make it explicitly clear that she wasn't wearing a wire. Now, had this been how he'd achieved such a high record of handling shoplifters? Did he basically just blackmail them into stripping down for him in exchange for turning a blind eye? Was the bizarre secret agent aspect some twisted gimmick? Did anyone actually fall for it? Did any of this matter? Not me. I saw red and managed to kick the closet door open, catching Colin in the act of taking a horrifically explicit shot of this girl bent over the table while she was crying and apologizing. Now I have a daughter. All I could see was red, and I didn't care if this was his first time or his 50th. I was going to drive Colin away in the same way that he'd been dealing with shoplifters. I told the girl to get dressed and get out of there, and to trust me that I'd deal with Colin if she didn't call the cops. But I didn't hold back. I gave Colin the beating of his life and then forced him to strip in the same way he'd forced that girl, and who knows how many others. And I took photos. Now, none of this was sensible. I'm not proud of it. Now, I should have reported him. But sadly, I know how impossible it can be to achieve justice for crimes like this. And so, giving Colin a beating he'd never forget and lowering myself to his level, maybe it wasn't right, but it felt like the best option I had. Finally, I told him that if he ever quit the job while I was there, if he prevented me from being able to keep a close eye on him, I would find him, and I would make him regret ever trying to avoid me. I told him I had him by the short and curlies, and I'd never be letting go. And if I ever found out that he'd been up to his old tricks, his life would not be worth living. I guess men like him are cowards, because he believed me. And to this day, I still work with him. Maybe I should have reported him, but I have no idea who his victims were. No idea if they'd play ball. And I figured that it would be better that I kept an iron vice grip on him. I remember when I did my onboarding at my grocery store, and I had to watch some BS video teaching me all sorts of crap I already knew, and a bit of stuff that I didn't. One of the main things that I did know was that you shouldn't directly confront aggressors or shoplifters. You should let them steal the item and then call the cops. I knew this with or without the video, but it was such a hard thing to actually convince myself of. If I saw some dude stealing something, it was in my nature to want to mess that guy's day up. I didn't want to sit back and call the cops. I wanted to dive in there like some kind of manly, badass hero. Like Let's Read, my favorite YouTuber and male role model. And so this video said something like, "Do not engage. Under no circumstances must you put yourself in danger. The shoplifter could be armed. They could be dangerous. Your life is worth more than a tin of Spam or a potato. This isn't the Apple Store. Blah, blah, blah." And so I'm thinking, fine, sure. I'm not dying for a company that probably won't even remember my name 5 minutes after the funeral. So I kept my head down, followed the rules, and did my job exactly as I was trained. Now, it was just a stupid grocery store job. I was a stalker. We all got by doing our jobs and really nothing else anyway. And that's how you survive a minimum wage job in the first place. But then came in a guy named Harlan. He wasn't a doctor. I don't think he even had a PhD. He was just one of those guys who liked calling himself Harlan because I guess his real name was Miles, something that didn't sound very cool. And so Harlan watched the training videos, and he came back saying to us something like, "No way am I letting people steal from right under my nose." Now, we respond, "Well, sure thing, Harlan, old pal. Wait until you're up against a 6'5" biker stealing a can of beans. Who needs the money? Should just get a job like the rest of us." Harlan said it as if he hadn't gotten the job because his uncle was the assistant manager. Now, from then on, Harlan was on the lookout for shoplifters. He was determined to catch one in the act, just so he could prove himself and take down one of the bad guys. Now, weeks had passed, and then months, and Harlan was stuck as a shelf stalker, just like myself. The handful of shoplifters had been handled by the security guards, and Harlan was itching to spot a baddie who could be his little nemesis. Now, eventually, that nemesis showed up. She was a very old, grandmother-looking character, later discovered to be in her 80s, and she walked around with a stick, browsing the shelves and examining the items. Occasionally, she put some old person food in her basket. But then, while Harlan and I were watching her, this old lady slipped a small can of sardines into her purse. And that was it. She had stolen something, and Harlan was ready. This was the moment he had been gearing for. Now, I tried to tell him that you have to wait for them to leave the store to prove intent to steal. And I tried to tell him that there were really good reasons to wait and call the police. But Harlan just scoffed at me and said, "You don't mess with Harlan." And he approached this old lady. Now, Harlan was not the most tactful guy. He went straight in and said something like, "I saw you steal that can of sardines. I think it's best that you accompany me to the security office." As if this junior stalker even had the ability to handle shoplifters. No. The old woman just sort of looked at him, almost with pity, and she reached into her purse, and I was hoping that she would just remove the sardines and pretend it had been a mistake and everyone could move on. But no. What she pulled out next was a goddamn butcher's knife. I do not remember exactly what she yelled, but it was something like, "You'll never take us alive, officers." And then, with a strength entirely unexpected from a frail old lady, she plunged this butcher's knife straight into Harlan's chest, right by his heart. And the next thing I heard was the old lady murmuring something before running faster than I would have possibly expected her to toward the exit, and disappearing out into the parking lot. I do not think any of us spared the old lady any more thought in that moment. We were all tending to Harlan and putting pressure on the wound around the knife and calling the paramedics, calling the cops. Now, long story short, Harlan survived, but barely. The blade nicked his heart, and if it had been any further to the left, he would have been done for. And believe it or not, this old lady got away scot-free. Security footage seemed to suggest that maybe she was someone dressed like that. Honestly, looking back, it was all utterly bizarre. Now, it certainly taught Harlan the reason why we were told not to engage with shoplifters. You never know when the old lady's stealing sardines might be a knife-wielding maniac who nearly ends your life. So, this story happened on a Black Friday. The sun had just set, and the bargains had been bought, and the nearby Target in my mind was a war zone. I did not envy the folks who would be on cleanup duty the next day. And for me, though, it was not a problem. I was the manager of a gas station. We did not have to worry about Black Friday all that much. We just had to make sure we had enough hot dogs on the griddle, nudie magazines on the shelves, and Baja Blasts in the cooler, and the shotgun loaded behind the counter. It was just me and Lucky Ed, one of my coworkers. He was called Lucky Ed on account of his brain being bad. Now, nowadays, you probably would not call him that, but it is how Lucky Ed, who was a sweetheart, liked to introduce himself. Now, Lucky Ed was mopping the floor, and I was kind of just deliberating over whether it was time to toss the hot dogs onto the roller. And it was. And then an old fellow approached me as I was getting the garbage bag to toss away the wieners. And then he says something like, "You tossing them, pal?" So I said, "Yes." And he asked if maybe he could have a few. And so I respond, "Sure. Do you want them with buns?" And then he says, "Yeah, that's how you do a hot dog." That was a bit sassy for my taste, but whatever. So I just let him take a few hot dogs, direct him to the condiment station, and then go back to doing some admin on the old Windows ME computer that we had back then. You might remember it. Now, around 10 minutes later, Lucky Ed comes up to me and kind of tugs my sleeve, saying, "Hey, we got a problem." And there is always some problem with Lucky Ed. Usually, he saw an adorable mouse and wanted to make sure it did not get hurt, or some nonsense like that. But this time, he had a point. The old guy had made his hot dogs, but created an absolute apocalypse of sauce over at that condiment station. It looked like someone had exploded over there. And considering Lucky Ed had just spent half an hour cleaning up the condiment station, he was a little upset, and so was I, considering that the hot dogs had been a freebie for this old idiot. Now, I assumed that he had made his mess and long since gone, but it turned out that he was still there, and in fact was storming up to the counter, one hot dog in each hand. "These doggies be some steaming pile of overcooked shissin," the old man drawled out. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, they were old hot dogs that I was about to throw out, and he asked if he could have them for free. And Lucky Ed was asking me about what he was talking about, and I didn't really care to explain it to him. I just told the old guy that if he wasn't happy with his dogs, then he's welcome to provide me with his receipt, and I'll get right on that refund. "Refuse this," he yells, hurling the hot dogs at me. Now, one misses, splattering the "Hang in there" poster in the back, which is a zombie dangling from a noose, and the other dog hits me square in the face, sending the condiments dripping down my cheeks, and the wiener landing at my feet. Now, I'm too shook and kind of amused to really react, but Lucky Ed is not. He grabs the old man by the shirt and starts yelling how, "That ain't very nice, and you shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth." Now, before any drama can unfold, the front door bursts open, and some woman rushes in holding an expensive-looking MP3 player in its box. Now, she's yelling that she needs help because she bought the last cheap iPod at the Black Friday sale, and now there are customers after her, and could she please hide out there until they go away? Now, normally I would say yes, but the angry hot dog guy is still present, so I don't really want to seal the gas station with this dude inside. And so Lucky Ed seems to have an idea. He grabs the old man, drags him to the front door, and throws him outside, and then yells something like, "This guy stole the lady's iPod. Someone help her." Now, immediately, about 5 or 6 people come running from the direction of that target toward the old hot dog dude. Now, he has no choice but to flee as Lucky Ed locks the door, and we stand and watch as the angry customers chase that dude off without the iPod, off into the darkness. I go and clean up while Lucky Ed explains the situation to the lady with the iPod. She's extremely grateful and explains that she genuinely believed that the other customers intended to do her serious harm if we hadn't directed them away. Part of me felt bad that we'd endangered the old dude with the hot dog, but the part that still had sauce dripping down my face didn't feel too guilty, and that he'd have to outrun an angry mob. It just goes to show that sometimes charity gets you nowhere, and simply having good luck can be enough to make people want to hurt you. On the plus side, Lucky Ed had a chance to feel like a hero, so things could have been a lot worse. All in all, it was not the worst Black Friday I have had, but that is a story for another time. So, some years ago, my then boyfriend and I went to Mexico City on vacation. It was absolutely beautiful, and we followed the tourist guides and kept ourselves as safe as possible. I made sure that my boyfriend and I rarely separated. Well, he made sure, really. He was a protective guy and deeply cared about me and my safety. And as you will notice, sadly, I am referring to him in the past tense. I do not know that he is dead, but I have obsessively read and researched similar cases to have a good idea of what happened to my beloved Mario. Now, we were visiting a large mall just outside of Mexico City, and it had everything you could want: cheap technology, the latest fashion, and wonderful old vinyl records. We both grew up in poor, rough parts of Mexico, and this vacation was a dream for us, really. We had been exploring like tourists, convincing ourselves what it would feel like to be the people who could simply visit the country and spend time in the safe areas, avoiding the cartels and the violence and the burning tires and the screaming and all the parts you do not want to hear about. Visiting rich parts of Mexico City was kind of like our Disneyland. The night before, our tour guide had taken us to the Capolitas out in the wilderness. He said it was little known by tourists, but because we were locals, he was happy to take us to visit. It was a shrine to Santa Muerta. It used to be common to find public ofrendas that locals would come to and pray at. There would be tributes to Our Lady of Guadalupe, Santa Maria, Saint Jude, Santa Juan Diego, and many classic saints. But in recent years, worship and tribute to Santa Muerta has flourished throughout Mexico. We are a people living in the shadow of death. Many believe it makes sense to turn to Lady Death herself to hear our prayers. Death is invited upon us all, Dios mediante. Some believe the Madre de Muerta should receive her tribute, and that death will smile upon us if we kiss her feet and pray for bliss in the inevitable. That is what many believe anyway. Many others believe the cartels have soaked our country in blood and pushed Santa Muerta into the spotlight. I don't know. I only know that I and my dearest Mario followed our guide out into the desert that night, and we made our offerings before Santa Muerta. And then, within 24 hours, I never saw Mario again. We were exploring the mall. We didn't have many pesos to spend, just window shopping was fun, and we would dream. Looking at the latest fashion, trying on risque dresses for Mario's approval, checking out the newest iPhones, and browsing the latest records. We felt like shiny, happy people, like the song goes. And then Mario needed to use the bathroom. It was the first time all day we had planned to separate, and I wanted to browse the lingerie store and maybe buy something secret for him. So it seemed like the perfect time. I found myself caught up browsing bras and panties, fascinated and kind of horrified by how expensive it was to buy a piece of fabric that barely covered anything. And in the end, I settled on a lacy nightgown that was tasteful but sexy. And the sales clerk rang it up, and I went outside, ready to greet Mario. But there was no sign of him. I walked around the mall, calling for him, looking for him, but to no avail. And I went to the bathroom. Now, I must have looked like some huge freak standing outside the men's room calling, "Mario, Mario," through the doorway, but there was no reply. And in the end, looking around and seeing nobody there, I quickly ran in just in case. All the stalls were empty, all the urinals unused, and I kept investigating until an old white man came in and exclaimed, "Goodness me," in a very shocked voice, and I pretended I was the cleaner and quickly left. Now, I contacted mall security, and at first they wouldn't take me seriously at all. But then I sort of lied and said we'd been worried someone was following us. Now, on the cameras, we could see Mario enter the area where the bathrooms were, and then he never came out. They checked the women's room in case he was in there somewhere, and of course he wasn't. And the only option left was that he'd exited through a window positioned in one of the many blind spots of the outdoor cameras, and then left in a vehicle and was seemingly never seen again. Now, the next part was tearfully a blur to me. I remember telling detectives how Mario had recently proposed to me, and seeing a look pass between them like, yeah, this guy's left her at the altar, so to speak. But I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe my Mario would just ditch me like that. That wasn't him. It just wasn't. And then I started researching cases of people going missing from malls and public places, usually a member of a couple, to make it look like they ditched the other. There was this one case I read about where they eventually found the missing woman, and she was dead, and her body had been entirely hollowed out and filled with high-grade heroin, then attempted to be smuggled over the border. Now, every night, I dream of Mario walking into that bathroom and being accosted by someone who'd entered through the window. They could have been let in by anyone, and then they could have knocked Mario out, taken him through the window with his accomplices, bundled him into the back of a van, and then God knows what happened to him after that. Maybe he's still alive somewhere, being forced to work for the cartel. Maybe his body was used as a mule. Maybe whatever happened, Santa Muerte saw fit to make sure his death was a peaceful one, if that's what occurred. Or maybe Mario really did just leave me alone while I was buying lingerie, by fleeing through the bathroom window. If I found out this was true, I think I'd forgive him, just so I knew he was still alive. Every night, I find myself praying to Santa Muerta that Mario simply got cold feet, or decided he didn't love me anymore. The alternative is far too heartbreaking to bear. So around 2015, I worked retail on Black Friday and agreed to be there from opening. Never, ever again, though. It was the scariest incident of my life. And that was before I was nearly killed by an old man wielding a pickleball racket. And so the day started like any other Black Friday sales day. That is to say, all the staff were lined up like riot police, waiting for the doors to open and the customers to burst in and start fighting like it was a mosh pit over their 40% discounted TVs, or whatever else these people like to buy on Black Friday. I don't know. I'm not a retail worker. I'm a security guard. And so I was on the front lines here, as you understand, the first line of defense against angry moms wanting cheap baby formula, or gnashing grannies trying to get their grandson a cheap Nintendo Playbox or whatever, and then insisting that I'm hiding the imaginary product from her. And I could see the crowd getting restless through the front doors. The poor outdoor security staff were working extra hard to prevent a stampede, or what we like to call a crush, which is basically a surge of people who could literally crush you. And at one point, I was sure I saw the glass on the front door start to crack. Now, thankfully, I imagined that. We were all standing there, braced like we were preparing for a riot when the doors were about to open. And I'd never felt more nervous in my life. I've worked Black Friday since then, but this was my first time, so I really didn't know what to expect. Now let me tell you, when you see footage of those riots and the way people fight each other for their little bargains, it isn't an exaggeration. If anything, it downplays how severe it really is. The doors open and a human ocean bursts into the store. Now I won't name the big brand store I work at. I don't want to get fired. But pick any store with footage of people going insane over cheap televisions and discounted sound systems, and it was one of them. Now every type of person you can imagine came flooding into that store that morning. You had the angry grandmothers with sharp elbows and even sharper tongues. And you had the Joe Rogan wannabes who wrestled their way to the toy section, trying to grab the cheapest Furby or whatever boy's toy was making the rounds. And then there were the big ladies pushing for their cheap hair dryers, and then all the other types of people who just wanted their hands on discounted 4K TVs and UHD players. Now you can't really blame them. Some of the prices were obscene, and if I hadn't been at work, I might have been right there in the crowd, fighting my way through for bargains like a rock'em sock'em robot or whatever. But instead, I was stuck corralling the crowd down the right aisles, trying to keep soccer moms from sucker-punching deadbeat dads. And I'm pretty sure that at one point, I even saw some IRL streamers broadcasting the whole thing. Now, it was chaos. Absolute chaos. Just a royal rumble of retail that's far scarier when you're on the ground than any footage could ever convey. But let me try anyway. These are some of the things that went down that day. 2 old men got into a fight over a bowling ball, which ended with one of them smashing the other's knee using that same bowling ball. In the kitchen aisle, an angry mother of 4 got into a fight over the last blender. So she used the show model to try and knock her rival unconscious. Now, this backfired, causing her to twist her wrist and the rival to swipe that blender out from under her. 2 different customers got trampled, including one with a broken arm. And thankfully, there were no deaths. Now, quite possibly my favorite, though, was the 2 adult neckbeards who got into a fist fight over Magic the Gathering cards and ended up trashing the entire toys and games department by throwing each other against the shelving units. This also makes it sound like I wasn't doing my job, but trust me, I was. And so were the rest of my colleagues. If it wasn't for us, I'm convinced there would have been deaths, multiple deaths. And the cops told us as much in the aftermath of the sale. There was so much damage, so much carnage, that we ended up losing more stock to damage than we even sold. Now this might all sound comical and even silly, but I want you to consider this. Humans were willing to behave this way toward each other over a little bit of money off a TV. One man broke another old man's knee with a bowling ball, like I said, and that injury will probably last for life. The blender to the head. Thankfully, that didn't cause damage, but imagine if it had shattered. That could have taken someone's eye out. And on top of that, we've got these absolute clowns who trashed an entire aisle of children's Christmas presents because they wanted to fight over some playing cards. It doesn't sound so silly and funny when you look at it like that, does it? Working security during Black Friday really severely challenged my faith in humanity. I had to start going to therapy just to convince myself that the majority of people aren't selfish, awful humans. And I'm not convinced that's untrue. The therapy might be for other stuff as well. So when you see these crazy videos online, remember, these aren't just one-off events that happen in far, far away Walmarts. These are your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, and they're prepared to crack you over the head with a 4K monitor if it means they can save $20 on that Nintendo Switch they've been coveting. Now, I'm convinced that somewhere Satan's watching a Black Friday Madness compilation on YouTube and just laughing his butt off. I just wanted to send this in to say, be careful if you ever go Black Friday shopping. I'd hate for you to lose your head over a Superman action figure or some rare Charizard. 'Cause know this, I've got dibs on that fella. The grocery store at the end of my block closes at 11 p.m. If you go after 10 p.m., you can usually find some good deals on discounted products. It's also usually dead quiet, so you don't have to deal with other customers. Just one or two late-night shoppers like me, and staff trying to stock the shelves to get things done early. That night, things felt weird on the walk over. It's only a 5-minute walk, but I was certain I was being followed. I looked around, and sure enough, at a distance, there seemed to be a guy in a pastel blue hoodie and white pants. He didn't seem threatening. He was just sort of walking at the exact same distance behind me the whole way. If I stopped, he seemed to find an excuse to stop as well. So I went into the grocery store, and down at the end of an aisle, I saw the guy who I believed had been following me. But that was absolutely impossible, I thought, because he definitely hadn't passed me. So I headed a little farther down the aisle, keeping an eye on my guy, and eventually I realized it wasn't the same guy, but he seemed to be dressed exactly the same. Now, I don't know how to prove it to you exactly, but it definitely wasn't a uniform or a coordinated gang outfit or anything like that. What kind of uniform consists of a baby blue hoodie and white jogging pants? Then I heard the front door of the grocery store open, and in walked the guy who had been following me earlier. The first thing he did was come and stand right next to me, looking at the same food I was, some sort of nacho kits, if I remember right. And he was standing weirdly close to me. It felt threatening, but without any direct threat happening, if that makes any sense. So I edged down the aisle, and the guy stuck to me like glue. Meanwhile, I could see the other identically dressed guy just standing there, watching the two of us, pretending to look at some cheese. After a while, I headed into another aisle, and there I saw a third guy dressed exactly the same. He was just standing there, looking at some cereal the whole time. These didn't look like uniforms, and they definitely didn't work at the store. But the strange thing was that they didn't seem to acknowledge that they knew each other at all. The only thing I was certain of was that they were all watching me. Now, I'm just a guy around 5'10", and not exactly a pushover, so I wasn't as worried as I could have been. But I don't really know how to describe it. I got this dark, wrong feeling from all of it, like the people surrounding me had some kind of darkness to them. Now, I'm not usually the type of person who gets paranoid or attributes things to the supernatural, and I don't think these guys were actually demons, but they felt demonic, if that makes sense. Eventually, the one who'd spent most of his time standing right next to me moved off to do some grocery shopping of his own. I went around to the final area near the checkouts, and I saw a fourth, identically dressed guy walking toward the second guy I'd noticed. I expected them to greet each other, but instead, they showed absolutely no sign that they even knew each other. In fact, one of them apologized for getting in the other's way. There also seemed to be some slight sense of dislike between the two, which I still can't really explain. I hung back like a coward and waited until all four of them had finished their individual small grocery picks. 3 of them used the self-checkout machines. One of them paid at the kiosk because he had also bought cigarettes and a lottery ticket. They all left at different times, and aside from that brief interaction near the checkout, they never really interacted with each other at all. Now, before you think maybe they were siblings or quadruplets playing a joke, 2 of them were white. One of them was a light-skinned black guy, and the fourth, I don't know what he was in terms of race. They certainly weren't related, and they seemed to be different heights. They were the same age and wore the same strange baby blue hoodie and white jogging pants, and they all just kept watching me. I finally started to understand how those gang stalkers fall down that rabbit hole. And when I got to the checkout, the elderly woman who rang up my items was someone I saw there often as a regular customer. And she glanced around the store, then leaned in and whispered to me, asking if I'd seen those guys just now, who were all dressed exactly the same. I said, yeah. It was wild that there were 4 of them at the same time. She shook her head and said that altogether there must have been 6 of these guys. Two of them had left the store before I arrived. Then she went on about how she wasn't normally the superstitious type, but they gave her the heebie-jeebies. I couldn't blame her. I asked her if she had any theories. She said the best she could come up with was that it was the Saturday after Black Friday. Whether that meant anything at all was unclear. Whether it had any real significance was also unclear. I've never really been able to find anything to explain it. The walk home was 5 minutes, but it felt more like 5 hours. The checkout lady almost begged me to get an Uber home. There was no way I was paying for an Uber just to go around the corner, and I would have felt ridiculous doing it. I didn't see the guys on the walk home, and I haven't seen them again since. I know it sounds like an anticlimax, but it was easily the creepiest and strangest thing that's ever happened to me at a grocery store. If anyone has theories about what was going on, I'd honestly like to hear them. Two of them watched me intently. One of them stuck to me like glue, until he suddenly didn't. Two of them ignored me completely, and two of them had left before I even arrived. At least one of them seemed interested in me. They were all dressed the same. They all carried the same kind of presence. Maybe they were gang members who decided I wasn't worth the trouble. I still wonder what other people would make of it, because I might be the only person who gets unsettled when someone is wearing a baby blue hoodie and white sweatpants.